Hey everybody, welcome to the videos for lineup building for week 15 of the NFL season over on Draftkings, more so focusing on cash game roster construction. Now a couple things before we start this video. Number one, the purpose of this is not for me to build you guys a lineups and use all of your contests. You have to be able to think for yourselves and build your own lineups. I'm not even sure what this is going to look like yet. I am building it on the fly. I'm just trying to identify players that meet a certain cash game criteria for me. One, they're going to have sufficient volume. Two, I like their matchups. Three, I like their price tags. 4, they're going to be decently high owned, and 5, they're going to see an uptick in usage with a normal starter or something like that being out. So that's kind of the plan for this video, and you guys can apply the same strategy to your favorite players as well. But if you find this video helpful in any way possible, please leave a like, and if you're new to the channel, hit that subscribe button. It really helps me out, and I really do appreciate it. And while you're at it, you might as well hit that notification bell as well, so you don't miss out whenever I post new content. And YouTube tells me around 50% of the people who watch these videos have not yet subscribed, so if you're a frequent visitor of the channel, or if you're just new and you like what you see, consider that subscribe button because it really helps the channel grow. It's obviously going to help me out as well. If you want to follow me over on social media, my handle is in the bottom left-hand corner of your screen. And if you want to help support the channel over on Patreon, the link is down below for that. If you want access into my entire NFL DFS data sheet, the Discord chat, cheat sheet, notes, projections, and all that fun stuff. But I think that's it for the plug, so without further ado, let's dive into today's video. Alright, if you guys have been watching my videos for quite some time, and I say this every single week, but I like to start with the running back position in cash games. I feel those are the most important pieces to our lineup because those are the guys that are going to touch the ball the most, more likely than not, in our lineups outside of the quarterback position. And when it comes to the wide receiver 2, wide receiver 3, flex, defense spot, we can kind of use lineup fillers there and just kind of make the lineup work best. For the running back position, I want to 100% absolutely make sure that's the guys that I want in my lineup, because I don't want to get stuck with some random running back that I don't think is going to get the ball too much, and plus it's a pretty bad matchup overall. So with that being said, let's move on to running backs here. And there's like 4 guys I want to build around. I'm going to try 3 variations of lineups in this video. But the 4 cash game running backs this week, in my opinion, it's Derrick Henry and Alvin Kamara up top. And then in the mid-range, we have Cam Akers at 6,600, a great spot versus the Jets being such large favorites at home. And then if you want to go cheap, we have Leonard Fournette at $4,500 with Ronald Jones being out. I would say he's going to be very popular in the flex spot on this slate. So those are like the 4 running backs I think are great in cash games. You can also give an honorable mention shout out to guys like Jonathan Taylor. And I also think Kenyon Drake at 5,500 somewhat viable as well. And there's a couple other guys like J.K. Dobbins, but I feel like he's more of a tournament play. But anyway, let's start building lineups. So I'm going to try to just mix and match those 4 guys across 3 lineups, and we'll see how they look. But up top, we have Derrick Henry at $9,500. I realize he is absolutely breaking the bank here at nearly $10,000. But the amount of volume he's going to get in this game versus Detroit, they're 11-point favorites at home. Last time I checked, they had the highest implied team total on the slate. Everything just checks out here for a good Derrick Henry game. Because the thing with Derrick Henry, he doesn't really catch the ball. So if they happen to fall behind like they did in that game versus Cleveland in Week 13, he can kind of get phased out. He had 15 carries, which again is not that bad, but he only had 60 yards and not find the end zone. And in a game where they were trailing by 30 points at halftime, he only had 1 target. He's just not going to be that involved in the passing game. When they play with the lead, it's just going to be the Derrick Henry show. And we saw that last week versus Jacksonville, where they won 31-10. He had 26 carries on the ground, over 200 yards at 8.3 yards per carry, which is absolutely insane, and had 2 touchdowns. And he also had 2 targets, which again, it's not a lot, but I'll take 2 targets if he catches both of them. That's just an extra boost to your floor. But not really expecting anything out of the passing game for Derrick Henry. I think he's just going to absolutely smash on the ground. Detroit's allowing the 2nd most points per game at the running back position, and I think just everything checks out for a huge Derrick Henry game. He scored 39 points last week, and I would not be all that surprised if he happens to do something similar once again. So Derrick Henry is going to be the first guy that we plug into this lineup, and now we got to work on an RB2. And I think he's the most obvious play on the slate. I want to pretty much lock button him, to be honest, but Alvin Kamara at $7,400, he's an absolute steal, especially with the news that we got yesterday for him. So Michael Thomas is going to be out, and Drew Brees is going to be in, which is a massive, massive boost for Alvin Kamara. He should operate as pretty much the wide receiver 1 and the RB1 in this offense, plus this game should be an absolute shootout. We only have a 3-point spread and a 52.5 point over/under. Plus, Kansas City has struggled versus running backs this season, allowing the 21st versus running backs, and they're ranked 30th DVA versus the run. So absolutely love Alvin Kamara. I would not be surprised if he gets 10 plus targets. Should get around 10 to 15 carries on the ground, and he should absolutely smash. I know he doesn't get quite like Derrick Henry volume, which is going to get 30 carries on the ground, but Got to factor in of how involved he is in the passing game. This is a PPR site over on Draftkings, so those are very high value touches that Alvin Kamara tends to get. And Drew Brees, I can't imagine he's going to be slinging the ball down the field 50 plus yards every single play. So Kamara should get a lot of checkdowns, and I think he's in a fantastic spot here versus the Chiefs. And I'd say he's the best point per dollar option play at the running back position on this slate. So we have Derrick Henry and Alvin Kamara. And I mean, when you can start a lineup with those two guys, you should feel pretty good about it. Two of the best running backs in football. And instead of starting on wide receivers, I want to continue with the running back position because I think this is a pretty good week to go 3 running backs in cash games, because we do have a nice cheap one to use. And Uncle Lenny at $4,500 with the news that Ronald Jones is going to be out for this game. He's going to step into a full-time starting role. And we should be looking at close to 15 to 20 carries on the ground. And he should see a handful of targets because he's been the main pass-catching back in this offense. They're not crazy numbers like Alvin Kamara or something like that, but 3, 4, 3, 6, 6, 7 targets since week 7. Those numbers aren't that bad. If he happens to find the end zone, he'll easily pay off his price point at $4,500. Now, the matchup versus the Falcons, they've actually been kind of stingy versus running backs this season. They're top 10 DVA versus the run, and I believe they're allowing, I think, inside the top 10 fewest points per game to the running back position. So they've been a pass funnel defense, but if Fournette gets around 15 to 20 carries and gets a handful of targets and finds the end zone, even if he doesn't find the end zone, I think he can pay off his price point at $4,500. So this is mainly just a price and volume play for the most part, and I feel pretty good about plugging him into our flex spot. So we got Henry, Kamara, and Leonard Fournette. I think that's a good trio of running backs to start our lineups with. All right, now that we have our foundation set with our running backs, we can either grab the quarterback that we want to use, or we can start knocking down these 3 wide receiver positions. But for the purpose of this video, I think I want to move on to quarterback, and this is a quarterback I love this week, and it's Lamar Jackson at $7,500 if you're spending up. If you wanted to spend down, I also like Jalen Hurts as well. He's only $1,500, and he ran the ball 18 times last week for over 100 rushing yards. So depending on the way you want to build your lineup, if you want to spend up a little bit more for the wide receiver position, you could drop down to a guy like Hurts. But I think we're going to have enough money to be able to spend up for Lamar here, and he's just in such a good spot versus Jacksonville. The Ravens have one of the highest implied team totals on the slate, and Jacksonville is awful versus the run and versus the pass. No, versus the pass this season, they're 31st DVOA. Well, although I know Lamar Jackson's not really that much of a threat through the air this season. He's averaging less than 200 passing yards per game, but that's fine because he's been running the ball quite a bit the past month or so now. Now, his numbers haven't been as high as last season. On the year, he's averaging a little bit less than 70 rushing yards per game, and last year was around 80 rushing yards, which isn't too far off. But the past 2 weeks, he's had 124 rushing yards and 94 rushing yards. He also has 3 rushing touchdowns in that span, on his way to 27 and nearly 40 DraftKings points in that Monday night game versus Cleveland. So I don't think we're going to get a lot of passing upside here from Jackson, especially with them being, I believe they're double-digit favorites at home. So they're probably not going to be throwing the ball too much, but that's fine because Lamar Jackson should run the ball 10 plus times, and I would not be surprised if he gets around 100 rushing yards and finds the end zone. And if he throws 1 or 2 touchdowns with close to 200 passing yards, that should get the job done at $7,500 and an absolutely amazing matchup versus Jacksonville. Now, people might be afraid of them being such large favorites at home, but you got to keep in mind their other quarterbacks are injured, so he's going to pretty much have to be on the field. Plus, they're fighting for a playoff spot, so they have to win, and they're going to be playing motivated. So he pretty much checks each and every single box for me, and he's the cash game quarterback that I feel the most comfortable with this week. So now that we have Lamar Jackson, and we have $4,200 per player, which is not a lot, so we're going to have to spend down for the wide receiver position quite a bit. But with the news that Michael Thomas is out, it did open up some value on the Saints like Traquan Smith and Emmanuel Sanders, so I don't have really too many concerns here about being able to fit together a lineup. Plus, we can use a cheap tight end in defense. But I think we can still fit in a mid-range wide receiver, and there's a couple of guys I like in the 6K range, and I think it can work out. But I like Brandon Ayuk quite a bit. I think he's one of the best plays in the entire slate going up against Dallas. Brandon Cooks is a very strong play, being the wide receiver 1 for Houston or Deshaun Watson. And then Corey Davis is playable at $5,800. I feel like he's more of a tournament play, so I don't think I'm going to go there in cash games. But he is definitely viable versus Detroit, one of the worst defenses in football. And a little bit lower at $5,500, we have T.Y. Hilton, who I also think is one of the better plays on the slate given this price point. In the past 3 weeks, he does have 4 touchdowns when he didn't have a touchdown throughout the entire season until then. And he always plays good versus Houston. So I think these guys are all viable. But if I had the money for Brandon Ayuk, he's the guy I want. So if we have to drop down a little bit at the end of this lineup, if we need a couple $100 in savings, we can do that. But as of right now, let's just plug in Ayuk. He's been great for about the past 5 games, 24, 20, 19, 23, and 20. And the main reason I like him is because Deebo Samuel is out. And even with Samuel in, he was putting up some pretty strong games. But he had 16 targets last week. I think we see anywhere from 10 to 15 targets in this game. And it's a great matchup versus Dallas. They have struggled versus wide receivers all season long. He's going to be the main focal point in the passing game in this offense. So Ayuk, he's, I think, a tremendous play on this slate. And if I can fit him in, I would absolutely love to do that. The only problem with plugging him in is that we now have $3,700 left per player, but I'm hoping there's enough value to make it work. Plus, we got a lot of studs in our lineup already. We got Lamar, Derrick Henry, Alvin Kamara, then two not absolute studs, but two very solid options in Brandon Ayuk and Leonard Fournette. So at this point, we're going to have to dig a little deeper for some wide receivers to make this lineup work. But the one guy I definitely want to get in is Emmanuel Sanders. I think Traquan Smith's a fine play as well. I think he's $3,200, so he's pretty much free if you need the absolute pump play. I'm going to try to avoid going all the way down to Traquan Smith in this lineup, and I'm going to try to fit in Sanders here at $4,200. We could look at the per game numbers, but some of these games have Taysom Hill in, and some of these games have Michael Thomas in, so that's kind of pointless to do. But way earlier in the season, he was having some strong games with 15, 15, 27 points, and 13 points. And if we get somewhere around there at $4,200, that's definitely going to be fine for me. So we're just going to plug him in. He's cheap. This should be a high-scoring game. I know we're doubling up on the Saints here, but I actually think you could play 3 Saints in cash this week. I don't think that would be an issue. So we got a 52.5 point over in that game and a very tight spread. It should be back and forth. And I know the Chiefs are tough on wide receivers, but it's mainly just a price play with an uptick in volume with a guy like Michael Thomas being out of the lineup. Plus, we get our quarterback back. They get their quarterback back in Drew Brees. So now we have $3,500 left per player. So we could either find a wide receiver 3, or we could try to knock out defense and tight end. And just so I don't get stuck with like the Jets defense versus the Rams, let's try to find like a mid-range defense for the most part. And there's a couple of options I do like on this slate. Just obviously the Rams are in play at $4,500 if you have the money for them. I think they'd be a good play with Cam Akers. But if I played the Rams defense in this lineup, we'd have $3,050 left per player, which I think would actually be viable because we could play Cole Kmet. Then we'd have a $3,100 wide receiver, which I don't really want to do in cash games, so I don't think it's necessary to play the Rams defense here. So we'll try to find a more of a mid-range defense. I think the Titans are a great option here, especially since we have Derrick Henry. Because if you're playing Derrick Henry, you got to hope the Titans defense is at least being not awful, because you want them to play with a lead to play Derrick Henry so he can get the ball 25, 30 times on the ground. So just correlation-wise, it would make sense to want to play the Titans defense in this lineup. We could also use the Seahawks versus Washington. Not that scared of Dwayne Haskins and their offense, although I do know the Seahawks defense is definitely hard to trust. I think the Cardinals defense versus Jalen Hurts. I do like Jalen Hurts. I like the price point on him, but I don't think he's going to come out and put 30-plus points in the Cardinals defense. So I think they're viable. Then the Buccaneers at $3,000. I could see them being the popular defense of the week. Matt Ryan's not going to have Julio Jones. We know how bad Matt Ryan is without Julio Jones, so Bucs would make some sense as well. But since we have Derrick Henry, as of right now, we can plug in the Titans defense and we'd have $3,600 left per player, which I think would work. If we had to drop down to like the Bucs for a couple $100s, I had no problems with that, but it would just make sense to play the Titans with Derrick Henry here. So now for the wide receiver 3 spot in the tight end, we have $3,600 left per player, which is fine because there's some cheap wide receivers and some cheap tight ends that I like. Instead of going wide receiver 3 first, let's move on to the tight end position because there's a couple of cheap tight ends I like now. Obviously, I like Travis Kelce this week, but that's just not going to work. We don't even have enough to fit him in, and then we still have another guy to play. So we can't play Travis Kelce. Playing Mark Andrews would absolutely kill this because we'd have $1,700 left per player. It would be a fine pairing with Lamar Jackson, but that's obviously not something we can do in this lineup. So that means we're going to have to stick with this $3,000 range. But the good thing is we actually have a couple viable options like Jared Cook because Michael Thomas is going to be out. And then we have Cole Kmet here at $3,000, who I think is actually one of the better value tight ends on the entire slate. I've been saying this all week, although Jared Cook is definitely going to take some ownership off Kmet because people are going to rather play a guy like Jared Cook on a better offense than Cole Kmet on the Chicago Bears. So really we could play both here. Just for right now, we could plug in Jared Cook, but if we need the extra $400, we could go right down to Cole Kmet. I'd have no issues with that at all. And then we have 3 Saints in cash, but when you take out Michael Thomas and you add in Drew Brees into the lineup, these guys are just too cheap. Like Kamara, he's below $8,000. That should not be the case. Sanders is $4,200. Traquan Smith's nearly bare minimum at $3,000. And then Jared Cook's below $4,000. So you're mainly just getting these guys because of the price tags. And that would mean we have $3,800 left per player. And if I remember correctly, I think Michael Gallup is right at $3,800, or he's like around $3,500. So it could work as long as he is. Yep, Michael Gallup is $3,500. So if you want to plug him in, I think he's one of the better cheap wide receivers to use. Now, the ownership's going to come off him a little bit because guys like Sanders and Traquan Smith definitely opened up as value, but just point per dollar wise, he does great as one of the better point per dollar options at the position this week, and he gets targets. It's not like we're going to have to hope he gets onto the field. He plays nearly all the snaps in the past few weeks with Andy Dalton. 6, 11, 8, 5 targets. That's not that bad. He also had a pretty big game versus Baltimore. We had 11 targets, 7 catches for 21.6 fantasy points. Not saying that's going to happen again, but if he can get us a handful of targets, if not a little bit more, that's not that bad at $3,500. And I guess it'd be kind of like a mini stack for the San Francisco-Dallas game, having Ayuk and Michael Gallup. Not saying I'm actually trying to do that, but I do think that is a pretty solid lineup. So you'd have Lamar Jackson, Derrick Henry, Alvin Kamara, Brandon Ayuk, Emmanuel Sanders, Michael Gallup, Jared Cook, Leonard Fournette, and the Titans defense. So now that we got that lineup out of the way, I want to just mix and match these running backs. So for the next one, let's take out Derrick Henry, and then we're going to use Alvin Kamara, Leonard Fournette, and Cam Akers, some more of a mid-range approach. You might be able to spend up for another wide receiver or something like that to make that lineup work. So we can kind of compare those two and see how it looks. Now, I'm not going to try to change too much to this lineup. I still want Lamar Jackson here. I don't really want to change too much at the wide receiver position, but we might be able to afford like a more expensive wide receiver 2. Maybe Emmanuel Sanders could be our wide receiver 3, and that might make you feel a little bit better than having Michael Gallup and Emmanuel Sanders. But for right now, let's just plug in the running backs, and we'll see how much money we have left. So Alvin Kamara, he'll be the RB1 since we're going to leave Derrick Henry off of this lineup, and we're just going to see how that works, because when you take the $9,500 guy out of the lineup, it's definitely going to open up some salary cap for us. And then the RB2 will be Cam Akers. Now, I only talked about him briefly, but the past 2 weeks, he's definitely been trending in the right direction. Had 21 carries versus Arizona, had a target. Then week 14 on Thursday night versus New England Patriots, 29 carries, 3 targets for over 30 total opportunities, had nearly 200 rushing yards, nearly 200 total yards, didn't get to the end zone, but 24.4 fantasy points. Now, the Jets have been tougher versus the run this season, but the Rams are currently 17 or 17.5 point favorites at home, which always sets up well for that home running back, and that would be Cam Akers here. I imagine the Rams are going to be putting up quite a bit of points here, so he's in a great spot. And if you want to forego Henry in your lineups this week just to play a guy like Cam Akers and save some money to spend up for another running back, I think you can get maybe at least somewhat similar production here from Cam Akers. Now, it's a tougher matchup overall versus the Jets. They have been a little bit stingy versus running backs, but we're talking about a $3,000 price difference, and I think they could be at least somewhat similar on a point per dollar basis. So we'll plug in Cam Akers there as our RB2. Then for the flex, we're going to keep Fournette there just because of that price point. He's kind of just a free square, really, to be honest. So we already talked about him, so I don't have to go too in depth there. I want to keep Lamar Jackson here in that great matchup versus Jacksonville, and since we're dropping off from Derrick Henry, it should be even easier to be able to fit in Lamar Jackson here. Now, at this point, I guess this is where we can start changing some things. I still want to fit Ayuk in. I don't think that's going to be an issue. We could afford him in the last one with Derrick Henry, so I'm assuming we're still going to be able to afford him here. So we're going to keep Ayuk in the lineup, and now we have $4,400 left per player. And now before, when we had Derrick Henry, I think we were at, what, $3,700 left per player when we plugged in Ayuk, so we're definitely got a bit more money to spend up. So now at this point, we can either go on wide receiver 2, tight end, or defense. Now, I know for sure I want to play Emmanuel Sanders. Now, he could technically be our wide receiver 3 in this lineup, but let's just plug him in right now so we know how much money we have to work with. So if we plug in Emmanuel Sanders, we're talking $4,500 left per player, which is definitely a lot more money than we had recently. So I feel a bit better about this lineup overall. Now, I don't like not having Derrick Henry. He could definitely explode for 40, 50 fantasy points. It's just kind of personal preference on your roster construction, but this definitely makes things a little bit easier. Now, for the defense, tight end or wide receiver 3, I feel like I just want to go to defense here just to see how much money we have to work with. Now, to fit in the Rams defense with Cam Akers, that would actually make sense correlation-wise. I'm not sure if it'll be able to work, but we could plug it in just to see if the correlation would work. Now, I'm not saying you absolutely have to play the Rams defense with Cam Akers. You could certainly pay down for a Buccaneers defense or something like that, but we still have $4,500 left per player, and I know I can spend down at the tight end position, so this lineup actually might not be that bad, even though we're spending all the way up for a defense. Although at the end, I could try to play around with it, see if we could drop off the Rams defense. Maybe we can afford a even better like wide receiver 2, wide receiver 3, or something like that, or maybe even the tight end spot, but we have $4,500 left per player, and we could fit in a Cole Kmet or Jared Cook, and then we'd have well over $5,000 left per player. So let's plug in Kmet here just to be a little bit different from the last lineup since we had Jared Cook, and that gives us $6,000, and I'm pretty sure Brandon Cooks is right around that price range. I know for sure Corey Davis is, or I'm actually right there right now. So yeah, Brandon Cooks, he's $6,000, and that would even out our lineup. We could also use Corey Davis, or we could even use T.Y. Hilton. So there's actually 3 strong mid-range wide receivers to use there. Even Antonio Brown versus Atlanta is somewhat interesting, but he's definitely more of a tournament play than a cash game play. But since it evens out our lineup, I think Brandon Cooks is in a pretty good spot here. Now, the overall matchup versus Indy, it's pretty tough, but with no Will Fuller He's going to be the wide receiver 1 here. Now, he missed last week, but last game versus Indy was in week 13. He had 8 targets in that game, 5 catches, only 11.5 fantasy points. Got to keep in mind he got his brain scrambled in that game. I'm surprised he came back in. That guy has a bad history of concussions, but he came back in. I know he wasn't out too long, but we should be looking at close to 10 targets in this game. And this game also features a 51-point over/under, and the Houston Texans are pretty big dogs here on the road, so I assume they're going to be in a passive game script that they are most weeks. So I think Cooks could find his way to 10 plus targets and close to 100 receiving yards. And if he gets to the end zone, you'll probably be pretty happy at a $6,000 price point. I know it's up from the past 4 games and pretty much all season, but I do like the spot for him being the wide receiver 1 in that offense, and I think that's not a bad lineup. You have Jackson, Kamara, Cam Akers, Ayuk, Sanders, Brandon Cooks, Cole Kmet, Leonard Fournette, and the Rams defense. Now, if you want to drop off from the defense a bit and maybe spend up more for a guy like Brandon Cooks, I think you could do that as well. Or you could even go the tight end route where you could upgrade Cole Kmet to Logan Thomas or something, because you'd save about $1,000 if you dropped off from the Rams. But even then, I'm not really sure the difference in production from Logan Thomas and Cole Kmet would be worth dropping from the Rams defense versus the Jets to another team like that. But anyway, moving on to the third and final lineup, I want to do a spend up RB approach. Now, I know we've already been spending up for running backs, but I want to see if we can get a Henry, Kamara, and a Cam Akers lineup. So instead of having that value play Leonard Fournette, we'll see if we can spend up for running backs, and then we're definitely going to have to go cheap at wide receivers, but I still think we can make a Lamar Jackson lineup work even with those guys in. So for the spend up running back approach, we're going to just jam in Henry here, Alvin Kamara, and we'll put in Cam Akers in the flex spot at $6,600. I still want to have Lamar Jackson. Nothing has changed there. If you have to drop from Lamar Jackson to a cheaper quarterback like Kyler Murray, I think that's fine as well. But just for the purpose of this video, I want Lamar Jackson in there. And now we have only $3,800 left per player. So I'm not sure I'm going to be able to fit in Brandon Ayuk this time, unfortunately, because if I plug him in right now, we'd have $3,100 left per player. And as much as I want to get Ayuk in, I don't think that is going to work, unfortunately. So we're going to have to go a little bit lower than Brandon Ayuk. And just to be a little bit different, since we haven't used Traquan Smith yet, I do think he's a pretty good play. Let's plug him in over Emmanuel Sanders just to change it up. Now, I obviously prefer Emmanuel Sanders over Traquan Smith, but since we don't have much money in this lineup build that I'm going to do, let's use Traquan Smith now. So $3,200, and actually last week I believe he had 6 targets. That was with Taysom Hill, but no Michael Thomas. In the past 2 weeks he did have 6 targets. So if he gets like 6 to 8 targets in this game at $3,200, yeah, he'll definitely pay off his price point. So using him, we have nearly $4,000 left per player, which opens up some things a little bit more. I mean, if we plugged in Ayuk right now, we'd be sitting at, and still use Traquan Smith, we'd be about $3,000 left per player, which I think might be somewhat doable if we go really cheap at defense, but it would definitely be a tough task to do. So now we have a wide receiver 2, wide receiver 3 spot open in the defense and tight end. So just for the defense, I need to go cheap here. Let's plug in the Bucs since we haven't used them yet. I think they're probably going to be the most popular defense at their price point because they're going up against Matt Ryan without Julio Jones, and it's an overall pretty solid defense. So let's plug them in, although if we had to go a little bit lower to someone like the Cardinals or maybe even the Vikings versus the Bears, I don't think that's awful, but there's not really that many good cheap defenses this week. So hopefully we don't have to go any lower than the Cardinals. But as of right now, we have the Bucs in. So we have $4,200 left per player, a little bit more than $4,200. So I think we can make this work. Now we could still use Emmanuel Sanders, but I'm going to try not to use Emmanuel since we've had him in all 3 lineups. I do think he's one of the best cash game plays this week, but I'm going to try to be a little bit different here. So one of the other cheap wide receivers I like, which we're probably going to need since we're running low on funds here, was Michael Gallup at $3,500. I think he's just a fine volume play given his price point. Plus, the Cowboys are probably going to be trailing in this game, so I mean, he should get you 5+ targets, which is fine at that price. So we're plugging Gallup, and now we have $4,600 left per player. We can still use a cheap tight end. Since we don't have Emmanuel Sanders, let's get another Saints pass catcher here. So let's just plug in Jared Cook at $3,400. If we have to go down to Kmet, we can do that as well, but it shouldn't be too much of a big deal here. Now we have $1,500 left per player, which means we are just missing out on Brandon Cooks at $6,000. Now, if we wanted to use Brandon Cooks, we could just drop the Buccaneers defense to the Cardinals, which I think is fine. I do think the Cardinals will have some decent ownership this week. Or if you don't want to do that, we could either just play Corey Davis at $5,800, or we could use T.Y. Hilton at $5,500. And if we use T.Y. Hilton, since we're using Derrick Henry, again, it would make sense to want to play the Titans defense. So we could just drop from the Bucs. Well, I guess not drop, but add from the Bucs to the Titans here at $3,400. And then we'd zero out our lineup. So you'd have Lamar Jackson, Derrick Henry, Alvin Kamara, Traquan Smith, Michael Gallup, T.Y. Hilton, Jared Cook, Cam Akers, and the Titans defense. If you wanted to go the Brandon Cooks route over T.Y. Hilton, you could go back to that. Then you could drop to Brandon Cooks here at $6,000. Well, you could not do that. Now you could go to Brandon Cooks at $6,000, and then you have $2,900 left for defense. And instead of using the Saints, because I don't want to play this any defense versus Patrick Mahomes, you could use the Cardinals here versus the Philly offense that really hasn't been that great this season. Now I think it's going to see a boost with Jalen Hurts. We saw them beat the Saints last week, but overall at $2,900, I don't think they'll kill you. I think that's another fine way to go. So it would really just be Cooks and the Cardinals defense versus T.Y. Hilton and the Titans defense. I think either way is fine, but I think that's going to be it for the video, guys. I hope this was helpful, and if it was, make sure you leave a like, and if you're new to the channel, hit the subscribe button. It really helps me out, and I really do appreciate it. And if you want to follow me over on Twitter, I'm at ChrisPennell16, CPenn16 over on IG. And if you want to help support the channel over on Patreon, link is down below for that. And if you want to check out my Saturday slate video, I'm probably going to have this video posted slightly after 1 p.m., so you still have a couple of hours to check that out. We have a 2-game slate today starting at 4:30 p.m. 2 solid games too, so I am looking forward to it. So check that video out if you haven't already. But I think that's going to be it. Hope you guys enjoy the start to your weekend, and I'll see you guys in the next one.